Well, today, as they said, we're wrapping up our message series in the book of Nehemiah that began all the way back in January. And I hope we've learned a lot along the way from one of the Bible's most effective leaders. He's an amazing guy, Nehemiah. So let's go there now. Turn with me, if you would please, to Nehemiah chapter 13. And if you were with us last weekend when we studied chapter 12, we saw this amazing worship service that Nehemiah and his friend Ezra were leading. The city of Jerusalem, tens of thousands of Israelites gathered together, celebrating God, singing, worshiping. The wall was rebuilt. The gates were restored. The enemies were repelled. The temple was reopened. Their spirits were revived. Their city was repopulated. There was a lot to celebrate in this worship service, but that kind of ends. So chapter 13 opens with almost like an epilogue sort of sense to it, because there's this time lapse that takes place between the end of 12, beginning of 13. Sometimes the chapter breaks don't exactly fit. So the first few verses in 13 probably should have been in chapter 12. The versification was not in the original text. It's not inspired. It was some monks like in the 1200s that put that in there for us. And them monks didn't get it right all the time. Anyways, as they normally don't. Anyways, sorry, monks. But so there's this time lapse that takes place, and the reason is because Nehemiah goes away for, we think, about 10 or 12 years, and then he comes back to Jerusalem. He comes back to Jerusalem. So that coming back starts in verse 4. So let's pick it up there. Here's what it says. Now before this, Eliashib, the priest who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah, prepared for Tobiah a large chamber where they had previously put the grain offering, the frankincense, the vessels, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, which were given by commandment to the Levite singers and gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. And then verse 6, while this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem. So this is Nehemiah speaking in the first person. I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king. And after some time, I asked leave of the king and came back to Jerusalem. And then I discovered this evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. And I was very angry, Nehemiah says. And I threw all of the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. And then I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back there the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. So let's pause there for a second, because what we just read was pretty shocking given the givens, all things considered. For starters, we see this guy Tobiah pop back up again. And now for those of you who've been studying, do you remember this fella, this guy Tobiah? Does that ring a bell? Raise your hand if that rings a bell, okay? This is the same Tobiah that we encountered earlier, who is public enemy number one for God's people, because this dude did whatever he could to hinder the project in every way, shape, and form. Remember this. It was all about delay, distract, detract. That's what Tobiah did. He mocked Nehemiah. Tobiah threatened Nehemiah. He tried to distract him. One time he invented a fake peace summit that wasn't even real, in order to pull Nehemiah off the wall project out of Jerusalem into this retreat center somewhere in Palestine. And hey, let's discuss our differences, Nehemiah. Let's talk about our feelings, and maybe we can come together. And this was all a plot to pull Nehemiah away from his security, to murder him. And then that didn't work. He wrote the king talking a mouthful of trash about Nehemiah. He threatened Nehemiah with death. Basically, this guy was the biggest loser in the Old Testament. He's up there, top 5. He's a sellout. He's got one foot in Israel, one foot in the world. He was married into Jewishness, so he picks up a Jewish honey and, sweet talks her and marries her. And so he's kind of now related to everyone. He does business with all the Jewish business people. So he's playing both sides. He's playing both sides. He's a bad guy. He's a bad guy. Turn to your neighbor and say, Tobiahs are always bad guys. And somehow we just read this little schmarmy, farmy guy worms his way in, and he's living in the temple of God. That's what this says in verse 13, in chapter 13. It says that Eliashib, the priest, converts part of the holy temple. Okay, the temple of God, right? The center of God's presence on planet Earth in the Old Testament. You know, the Holy of Holies. And there was this interior temple where the presence of God, the Ark of the Covenant, was there where, this is where like the tablets of the 10 Commandments were kept. This is where a little jar of manna was stored. And then along the side of the building, there were these storehouses where they kept the worship equipment, and they kept the tithes of the people, grain offerings and so forth. And so Eliashib, the priest, he pulls all of the worship equipment out and the tithes, and he makes this place for Tobiah, who's not Jewish, to live. So he wasn't supposed to be there. This is holy ground, and yet we see this dude has a 3-bedroom, 2.5-bath luxury suite. He's not paying rent either. He's a squatter, okay? He's a total freeloader in the most precious square footage in all of Israel. And so this was like total desecration. I mean, this was kind of like mind-popping, eye-popping, like, how did this happen? How did this happen? And so remember, when we left, Nehemiah, before he left, everything was going great. Man, Israel was back on track. And then he leaves, and then this unthinkable compromise happens. So this is bad news. Now, the good news is Nehemiah's back in town, and he shows us in this chapter, he shows us once again what effective leaders do, what godly leaders do when faced with situations. And so this is the lens in which we're going to read and study this chapter. We're going to bop around in here a little bit. Let's look at this from a leadership lens. You can take out those message notes if you haven't already, and let's give you your first fill-in. Here's what we can say about this. Effective leaders, first and foremost, deliver on their promises. As I said, when Nehemiah, when in chapter 12 he goes back to the king to get his old job, working for Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes Longimanus is a real king in Persian history. We have this in the historical record. We actually have, I think, at least one chiseled bust of him. We sort of even know what he looked like. And so the reason why Nehemiah goes back is because he made a promise. And we actually read about this and studied this earlier in the book. It's way back in chapter 2. Let me remind you, verse 6, there's this conversation Nehemiah is initially having with the king about him being released to go to Jerusalem in his first stint. And so the king said to Nehemiah, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will you be gone, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time to return. And so the king then, remember, he allows his trusted cupbearer, the number one security person on his staff, to go to Jerusalem in the first place, but on the condition that Nehemiah would come back, his promise, and then resume his regular duties. How many of you know this basic truth in life? Good cupbearers are hard to find. And so when you get a good one, you want him to stay on your staff. And so that's what was going on here. Now, Nehemiah, though, when he had been in Jerusalem and he had accomplished his mission, by the time he was done, man, he had really improved his station, as it were. He was the governor of this whole area. He was respected. He was a decision maker. He kind of was the man. I mean, whenever there was something big that needed to be decided, it came across his desk. And so he gave all this up for the simple reason that he just is a man of his word. He demotes himself because he made a promise. And he knows something. Nehemiah knows something about leadership, and he knows something about the scriptures. The scriptures talk about this. I'll give you one verse in Psalm 15:4. I'll put it on the screen. A righteous man keeps his oath even when it hurts. How many of you know this is the kind of leader you want to follow? A righteous person keeps their promises, even when it's to their own sort of hurt. It's not to their own gain. And this is what Nehemiah is modeling. And so the teaching for us that we're deriving here is that effective leaders keep their word. Effective leaders follow through. Effective leaders say things like, hey guys, here's what I'm going to do. And then the effective leader delivers on what the leader said they were going to do. And that's a person that you want to follow. That's a person that you want to be your boss. That's a person that you want, that's a father, that's a mother that you want to pour into and honor and respect as a kid. How many of you also know that flaky leaders are everywhere? Flaky leaders are the opposite. They're hard to follow. Flaky leaders don't show up. They change their minds. They're unstable. Flaky leaders tell you they're going to do something, and then culturally things kind of shift, and then they're like, oh, wait, that's not so popular anymore. Let me change my mind. Let me change my doctrine. Let me change my position with the wind. Don't we see this around in maybe some settings like politics and things, yeah? Leaders who shift with the wind are a dime a dozen. So what this is teaching us, guys, is the godly way of leadership, reliable leadership. Reliability is such a blessing. Reliability leads to stability. How many of you know we need stability now as a culture? And in your leadership settings, whether it's at home, at work, at school, all right, in your neighborhoods, right? We need people of integrity. Let me say it this way, a person's leadership impact is largely determined by their integrity. Not their gifts, not how fancy they are, not how good they are at talking, okay? It's integrity and character. I've had some fantastic leaders that have modeled this in my life. I'll name a few of them. My college pastor, actually Christy, my wife, our college pastor, this pastor, Fred Bradford, he modeled this so beautifully to us. And it really set in formulative years, it set the model for me. I've got men who've poured into me at my previous churches, and other leaders, just rock solid. We have this modeled in our own church. I get to see this. Our elder team, we've got 11 elders here at Redeemers who are so good at this. So with our elders, if you ever kind of hang out with these guys, they're not going to tell you a bunch of stuff. They're very careful about making a promise. And it's because when they say they're going to do something, they're going to follow through with that. And that's beautiful, godly leadership. We've got people, our staff pastors, who model this. Nehemiah, we're getting this from the scripture. We're getting this from the Spirit of God who's leading us in this way. God is this way. If God says he's going to do something, guess what? God does it. Now, some people say, oh, well, there's plenty of things that God says he's going to do that have not happened yet. That's right. Yet. If there's a promise from the Lord that hasn't been fulfilled, you can bank on it. It will be. It will be fulfilled because God, his yeses are yeses and his noes are noes. There's no shadow of turning in God. He's the perfectly reliable God of the universe. Okay, so Nehemiah then is pulling from his modeling is from the Lord. Now, as I said, when he goes back to work for the king, we have some sort of commentators, some theories on this. We think it's around 10 years or 12 years. Just to be, clear, some of the commentators think only 5 years. I think it's probably around a dozen years. He demotes himself. He goes back to the king's palace. The palace rotated depending on the time of year and the weather, and he's just doing his job. And he's just serving as a servant. He's demoting himself, and he's just doing a thing. So at some point, we just read, he then goes back to the king and says, hey, can I go back to Jerusalem and check on things? He asks permission. The king lets him go once again. And when he gets to Jerusalem the second time around, he does the same thing that he did the first time. The first thing, remember back in chapter 2, the first thing that Nehemiah does when he gets to Jerusalem is he doesn't do anything except walk around and just look at stuff and observe things. He's not coming in thinking he has all the answers and all his, theories. Hey, I read an article on the internet about leadership. And so he's coming in and learning the situation. He does that here in 13. And he sees a series of just like, cringy things that are going on And we just learned about one of them. We learned about Tobiah. That's the first thing that's very evident. That's in verse 7. In verse 10, I'll put this on the screen. What else does he see? I found that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them. The portion meaning the tithes and the offerings that the Levites and the worship leaders lived off of had been choked off. And so they all had to go out and work in the field. And so what this means is that they stopped worshiping because the pastors they had to go work the fields. They couldn't do church. They couldn't do sermons. They couldn't lead worship anymore. And this meant that the spiritual vitality was beginning to drop again. He also notices in verse 15 that Nehemiah says, in Judah, people treading wine presses on the Sabbath. They were working on the Sabbath. They were going to market and bringing in heaps of grain and loading them on donkeys and wines and grapes and figs and all kinds of loads, which they brought into Jerusalem to sell on the Sabbath day. And he says, I warned them, don't do that. So remember, the Sabbath was another issue earlier in the book. The people in Nehemiah previously had committed to stop working on the Sabbath, to rest, to worship. And when Nehemiah leaves, they uncommit and they stop worshiping, which meant that they weren't hearing the scriptures and they weren't resting and spending time with their family. Instead, they were just working. They were just selling stuff. They were making wine and on the Sabbath. And this was bad. This was not the way of the Lord. He's wired us to be recharged and to rest, and that involves not only physical rest, but family time, friend time, relationship time, and also spiritual refilling, which is what we do even in the New Testament. We follow this in various ways, the same pattern. So this is a huge step backwards. And then the last thing he sees, that he's walking around, he sees verse 23, I saw the Jews who had been marrying women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. And again, the Israelites were taking foreign spouses again. We covered this in detail a few weeks ago. We said that when you marry someone, you not only marry the person, but you marry their gods and goddesses. You do. And this is true today. This isn't just true in ancient times. When you marry someone, you also marry what they worship. Like if you marry a spouse who worships money, and maybe you don't worship money, but they worship money, eventually you're going to start worshiping money. Because of the closeness of the marriage relationship, it's impossible not to take on these attributes of spirituality with one another. It's just, this is how life works. Do you guys think this is true? Have you seen this? Okay, so that's the problem here. So these nations, Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, they all had national gods and goddesses, which meant that the Israelites were eventually beginning to take on other gods and goddesses and breaking the first commandment, and it was polluting the purity of their worship. So Moab, for example, this is just general Bible knowledge. Moab is this little country just to the east of Israel. A man from Moab is called a Moabite. A woman from Moab is called a Moabitess. Do you know what a dog from Moab is called? A Moabiter, okay? Do not underestimate how hard it is to tell the dumb joke on a straight face, okay, with a straight face. Actually, though, oh, goodness. Just warning you, here it comes. So what we found is, we found some dog breeds from this area of Palestine, particularly Moab, that are still around today. And so I found a picture of one, and here it is. This is a Moabiter. This is what they actually look like. Also happens to be the preferred Klamath Falls purse dog. Did I push it too far? Okay, so back to this. There was all these areas that he noticed of spiritual compromise. And here's the leadership. And so Nehemiah, though, he's paying attention and he's not ignoring what he's seeing. And this leads us to the second leadership lesson for us. That is, effective leaders don't turn a blind eye to the problems and the issues and the stuff. All right? Effective leaders don't turn the other way and pretend like they didn't see what they just saw. They don't pretend that the brokenness doesn't exist. They don't fool themselves that someone else will come along and fix the thing that they're seeing when it's their job to fix that thing. They don't blow it off because they're too busy. The temptation, though, is to blow off stuff that you see because it's just easier, at least on the front end, to ignore a problem. How many, just somebody give me a nod, like, this is just true. All right, it's true. I had a buddy who, this was a long time ago, we were in California, and he's like, I think I have termites. And I was like, okay, well, let's go see. And so it had like a crawl space kind of house. And so we go in with a wood subfloor, and we both crawl underneath his house. And man, he was right. There was termites everywhere. You know, termites, they're having a party. You could see them like they had a dating system. They were having babies. There was a little hospital. They had a party. There was a bar. There was a music. Man, they had been living down there, and it was like, this thing was bad. And so we crawl back out, and I'm like, what are you going to do? And he's like, nah, I don't know. I think I can let it ride for a little longer. And I was like, bad idea. Because if you ignore the termites, guess what? They're going to just keep having babies, and they're hungry. And so your floor is their food. And so, yeah, that didn't turn out well for him. It just caused more damage in the end. And this is pretty much true of almost every issue in life. And so it's never a good idea to ignore it. And so it's better to deal with it when you see it. And so Nehemiah, he does this. And that's because godly leaders, good leaders, they don't ignore the issues. To be an effective leader, whatever setting, in your house, you're a parent, you're a mom, you're a dad, at your job, at school, here at church, in your neighborhood, when you see something and it's in your leadership influence or your authority, then you've got to deal with the issues. That's what good leaders do. Good leaders solve problems. They don't ignore problems. Good leaders solve more problems than they make. If you make more problems and issues as a leader than you solve, then you're not a good leader. You're an ineffective leader, and that's what Nehemiah shows us. And a good leader doesn't create more problems by ignoring problems. A good leader solves the problems that come across their mind and their purview. So looking away can make wrongs worse, bad stuff worse in the end. So Nehemiah brings solutions to the issues, each of them I mentioned. So the first one is, we read this, the Tobiah issue. Tobiah. There's a Tobiah in the temple. There's a Tobiah in the temple. And so the passage, I love it. It's really a blue collar solution. It's really a redneck solution. Okay? What does he do? He takes Tobiah's stuff and throws it out on the sidewalk. Okay? He pulls Nehemiah pulls Tobiah's gross, disgusting couch that has stains all over it, and the Xbox and all the beer cans, probably Bud Light, let's be honest, right? And he cleans it out. He cleans out the place. And he's just like, he's not talking to Tobiah, all right? He's just like, you're out. He's evicting him immediately. He's like, I was angry and I took care of the issue. And I love that, right? It's so good. This is what he did. Now, it says he also cleansed the space, which meant two things. There was two parts of cleaning in this passage. The first one is they had to just scrub it out because Tobiah was nasty, all right? He was nasty, okay? He had his dog there, and his dog was gross. We already saw that. And so it just needed to be scrubbed. And then it also needed to be physically cleansed. And when it says purify, what that usually meant in Israel is that they would take a plant called hyssop and use hyssop to clean things. Now, hyssop is a beautiful, it's almost like a Middle Eastern lavender. And if you go on one of our Israel trips, in Israel, it's really cool. They have little essential oils of hyssop oil, and it smells so beautiful. And it's made from this plant that grows pervasively in this area. And it was used in Israel's worship in cleansing, spiritual cleansing ways. King David wrote in Psalm 51, Lord, purge me with hyssop and I shall be clean. And this was like signifying being cleansed from the foulness of sin. Physical cleaning with water, and then spiritual cleansing with hyssop. And Nehemiah did this. Hyssop was used in the book of Exodus, in when Moses is helping the people of God escape Egypt, and they're instructed to sacrifice a perfect lamb and then paint the blood of the lamb on the doorposts of their homes. The paintbrush, so to speak, was a bundle of hyssop. And so this was a spiritual cleansing. It was signifying that the foulness of sin, the compromise, was being forgiven and cleansed by God. So Nehemiah has to do this, both physical and spiritual, when he vacates Tobiah. And then it says he moved all of the worship furniture back into the room. And it also says Nehemiah started to restore the grain offerings, which meant that the priests and the worship leaders could now eat, which meant that they didn't need to go work in the fields, which meant that they could open church back up. And so you see this domino effect of the Tobiah compromise. You see this domino effect, and Nehemiah, the solution is to undo this and restore things so that things can get back on track again. And he wasn't there, he wasn't done yet, and I'll give you this fill-in, then I'll explain it. So the next fill-in is Nehemiah shows us that when necessary, effective leaders make the hard decisions. So it says that Eliashib was the priest. Now the priest was supposed to protect the people of God from the Tobiahs of the world. But the priest, Eliashib, was related to him, and he prioritized his own personal family and his own stuff over the spiritual vitality of the people of God, and he compromised. And so Nehemiah fires him. Look at this in verse 13. He says, I put Shelemiah the priest and Zadok the scribe and a Levite named Pedaiah in charge of the storerooms. The first verse said Eliashib was in charge of the storerooms, but Eliashib compromised, and so Nehemiah lets him go. And then it says, because at the end of this verse, because they were considered trustworthy. And these are hard calls to make. There's lots of different hard decisions to make. This is one example. Personnel decisions, staffing calls. Anybody who's a boss or a manager of a team, you know this. This is incredibly difficult. But effective leaders, godly leaders, don't just allow those Eliashibs, as it were, to just hang around, because it really does impact the organization. And so he removed the people who were not a fit, and he puts others in who wouldn't compromise. These are hard decisions to make. Let's talk about personnel decisions, because it goes beyond just business or staffing a team. Sometimes it's in relationships. Sometimes you have a bad relationship. Sometimes as a parent, your kids have friends who are influencing them in the wrong direction. This can happen. And so as a parent, you have to make a personnel decision, not about yourself, but about your kids' friends. Anybody ever had to do this? This is difficult. This is difficult, but guys, moms, dads, you got to do this. You're protecting your kids. And sometimes that means making a personnel decision. It also extends into dating and relationships. Sometimes if you're in a bad relationship, you got to make a personnel change. Sometimes you can find a Tobiah and you start dating a Tobiah. And it's like, oh man, this guy, I thought he was great. And he's going to take me to church and this and that, but he's a poser. He's not bringing you to the Lord. He's pulling you away from the Lord. And so you got to make a personnel change. This is difficult, but you got to do this. You got to do this. Sometimes it's our friends who pull us away from the Lord. They influence us away from Jesus. And so we got to make a personnel change. Okay. Sometimes we don't like to do this because it's easier to just, not have the conflict, isn't it? Because there's some people that just want to be friends with everybody. You want to just be liked in it. And I don't know, maybe you can in some cases, but sometimes you just have to say no. And you gotta kick Tobiah to the curb. Okay, tough calls. These are tough calls. Effective leaders make tough calls. All right, so John Maxwell, who's one of the sort of the leadership experts in our country, he says this is interesting about this. He says 95% of the decisions a CEO makes could be made by a reasonably intelligent 8th grader. I don't even know if that exists. Is there a reasonably intelligent 8th grader out there? Probably. But okay, that the CEO gets paid for the other 5% for making the tough calls. And this is what we've got. This is what godly people do. We trust God, and they're uncomfortable, but with the Lord's help and his grace in our life and his wisdom operating, then this can happen in our relationships, our kids' lives, our lives at work. We can experience Nehemiah level leadership making these tough calls. All right, I have a couple minutes. I just want to make one more point on this, and that is, let's go to the last verse of the whole book. So look at this with me. This is really fascinating. It says, "Remember me, oh my God, for good." What's the last word in the whole book? Good. So this is interesting. I don't know if you know this, but in biblical study, sometimes what we do is we go to the last word in a book, and it tells us things. In this sense, Nehemiah, good. Nehemiah is good. Nehemiah is a good book. Nehemiah is a good leader. He's a good model for us. In the book of Genesis, the last word is Egypt. The last word in the book is Egypt, and it's a precursor pointing us to Exodus, the book of Exodus, and what we're about to read. The whole Old Testament ends in the book of Malachi. The last word in the book of Malachi is the word curse. The curse of sin has not been broken yet until we get to the New Testament, Jesus. So these are just little helps that the Lord gives us in trying to interpret Scripture and understand Scripture. And here we see the last word is the word good. Nehemiah is praying here. It's a simple prayer. It's a beautiful prayer. Oh Lord, remember me for good. Lord, your goodness, remember me in your goodness. So the book begins with Nehemiah praying, and it ends with Nehemiah praying. And this is a beautiful thing. Now, the word good here in the Hebrew is translated into our English as favor or kindness, grace. So ultimately, this is Nehemiah's final lesson for us here at the very end, and that is effective leaders rely on God's goodness. There are many leadership skills in the Scriptures that we are encouraged to develop. There's many leadership principles. But the first and foremost one, the one at the top of the heap, is that none of us can do anything for God unless we have God's goodness and favor operating in our lives. That God's grace is the number one attribute of each and every one of us. If we seek to be fruitful, if we seek to make an impact, if we seek to live a life of purposefulness that will be a blessing to those around us, then that first and foremost has to be marked by being saturated with God's goodness and his grace and favor. We are people of grace and favor. We are people of God's goodness. God shows us his goodness in so many ways in Scripture. His goodness rebuilds the broken parts of our own lives. His goodness revives our own spiritual deadness. His goodness restores us in all that was ever lost in life's challenging storms. Friends, we serve and love and worship a good God. Nehemiah points us to the Good Shepherd, Jesus.